pharmaceutical company boss as a worthless loser who empties garbage cans. I'm Tony Williams, 64 years old, and have been in America for 35 years. What that arrogant Yale MBA didn't know was that his boss's company owed their entire existence to my hidden pharmaceutical empire. Every medical device they manufactured, every contract keeping them profitable, every supply chain preventing their bankruptcy, I controlled it all while driving my sanitation truck at 4:30 every morning. He had introduced me earlier to his executives as Maria's father who works in sanitation. Then during his wedding speech, he escalated to calling my immigrant heritage genetic contamination that would need to be bred out of his future children. But here's what Bradley Morrison learned that night. When you humiliate someone without knowing who they really are, you don't just destroy a relationship, you destroy yourself. If you're watching this, hit subscribe and tell me where you're from. Fellow immigrants especially, you'll understand this story. Here's how one wedding speech cost a man his entire career. Let me paint you the picture of how everyone saw me that day. I arrived at the Coral Gables Country Club in my 15-year-old Honda Civic. $85,000 they spent on this reception. I parked between a Porsche 911 Turbo with the license plate Pharma 1 and a Mercedes S-Class that cost more than most people's houses. I was wearing my only suit, a navy blue Joe's A-Bank special I bought in 2018 for my naturalization ceremony anniversary. My hands still showed the calluses from 30 years of lifting garbage bins. My work boots were polished, but they were still work boots. The other guests, pharmaceutical executives in $1,000 Italian suits, medical device manufacturers wearing Rolexes that cost more than my annual rent, Bradley's boss, Dr. Richard Hayes, Chief Scientific Officer at Morrison Medical Systems, had flown in from Switzerland just for this wedding. When I walked into the cocktail hour, I heard the whispers. That's Maria's father, the garbage man. Can you believe she's marrying into the Morrison family? Bradley's being very generous, don't you think? First sign I was being looked down on. During cocktails, Bradley brought me over to meet the Morrison medical executives at the bar. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Morrison, I'd like you to meet Maria's father, Tony. He works in municipal waste management. He said it with that practiced smile politicians use when they're managing an embarrassing situation. Dr. Hayes shook my hand with the grip you give to children and elderly relatives. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Williams. Essential services work is certainly important. 30 years this October, I replied. That's consistency, Doctor, Janet Morrison added, already looking around for someone more interesting to talk to. Bradley jumped in quickly. Tony's very dedicated to his route. Aren't you, Tony? Simple, reliable work. Nothing complicated about it. The pharmaceutical executives nodded politely, the way rich people do when they want to seem gracious about tolerating the help. Second sign. Bradley pulled me aside after the introductions. Tony, I need you to understand something. These people tonight, they're not like us. They control hundreds of millions in medical research. They make regulatory decisions that affect patient safety. I'd appreciate it if you kept conversations appropriate. Maybe stick to talking about sports or the weather. I looked at this 32-year-old kid in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his Yale MBA that he mentioned in every conversation, his pharmaceutical executive job title that he wore like inherited nobility. Of course, Bradley. I understand completely. He patted my shoulder like I was a well-trained pet. What Bradley didn't know was that I had every reason to stay patient. See, when you've spent 25 years carefully building a pharmaceutical empire through anonymous LLCs and offshore trust structures, you learn that invisibility is more powerful than recognition. I've been underestimated my entire life. When I arrived from Italy in 1989 on an H-1B visa, I couldn't speak English well enough to navigate the immigration office. I worked sanitation during the day, cleaned offices at night, and spent weekends in the University of Miami chemistry lab as a research assistant. People saw the accent, the work clothes, the tired eyes of a man working 80-hour weeks. They never saw the provisional patents I was filing, the pharmaceutical processes I was developing in borrowed lab time, the connections I was making with researchers who recognized innovation regardless of where it came from. My first patent, a water purification compound, came from watching industrial waste flow through Miami's drainage systems. Patent number 6,247,891, filed in 1997. Licensed to 3 pharmaceutical companies for a total of $2.3 million. But here's what really bothered me that night. It wasn't the condescension toward me. I dealt with that for decades. It was what Bradley had said to his groomsmen during the bachelor party last month. Maria told me later, tears in her eyes. At least the kids will get my superior genetics. We can breed out the inferior traits over a generation or two. My daughter. My future grandchildren. Inferior traits. That's when I knew this conversation was inevitable. I watched Bradley work the room that night, name-dropping his pharmaceutical connections, bragging about Morrison Medical's supply chain expertise, talking about regulatory compliance. If only he knew who really designed Morrison Medical's supply chain protocols. But patience, Tony. Patience. The real education was about to begin. Let me tell you what silence would have cost me. If I stayed quiet that night, if I let Bradley's introduction and his upcoming speech slide like I had for the past 2 years, it wouldn't just affect me. It would poison my grandchildren's future. Maria was 3 months pregnant. She hadn't announced it yet, but I could see it in her face, the way she touched her stomach when she thought no one was looking. My first grandchild was growing inside her, and Bradley was already planning to erase half of that child's heritage. Inferior genetics. Those words echoed in my head as I watched Bradley charm the pharmaceutical executives. I thought about my grandson or granddaughter growing up hearing whispers about their contaminated bloodline, about how Daddy's side was pure American excellence, while Grandpa Tony's side was just immigrant desperation that needed to be bred out. But the financial stakes were even more complex than anyone realized. See, Bradley worked for Morrison Medical Systems. They manufactured high-end medical devices, surgical instruments, diagnostic equipment, hospital monitoring systems. Annual revenue? $420 million. Sounds impressive, right? What Bradley didn't know was that Morrison Medical depended on pharmaceutical compounds controlled by a web of companies I'd built over 25 years. Not directly. That would be too obvious and legally problematic. Instead, through a carefully constructed network of LLCs, offshore trusts, and licensing agreements. Williams Chemical Solutions, LLC, registered in Delaware, held the patents. Mediterranean Pharma Trust, domiciled in the Cayman Islands, owned the manufacturing rights. Bellecourt Industries, incorporated in Ireland, handled European distribution. And Miami Innovation Holdings, a Florida LLC, managed the licensing agreements. Morrison Medical thought they were dealing with 5 different suppliers across 3 continents. They had no idea that every contract, every patent license, every supply agreement ultimately flowed through entities I controlled. The beautiful part? It was completely legal. Anonymous LLC structures, offshore trust arrangements, and patent licensing networks are standard practice in the pharmaceutical industry. Everyone from Pfizer to Johnson & Johnson uses similar structures for tax optimization and liability protection, but it also meant Morrison Medical was more vulnerable than they realized. Their primary surgical coating compound came through Bellecourt Industries, my Irish subsidiary. Their electronic monitoring components were licensed through Mediterranean Pharma Trust, my Cayman Trust. Their diagnostic chemicals were supplied by Williams Chemical Solutions, my Delaware LLC. Total dependency, approximately 68% of Morrison Medical's critical manufacturing inputs. Bradley had been bragging all evening about Morrison Medical's diversified supplier base and risk mitigation strategies. He had no idea how concentrated their actual dependency was. If I moved to terminate these relationships, following proper legal procedures, of course, Morrison Medical would face what the pharmaceutical industry calls a supply chain cascade failure. Not an immediate shutdown, but a 60 to 90-day process that would gradually cripple their manufacturing capacity. Under FDA Drug Supply Chain Security Act, DSCSA regulations, pharmaceutical suppliers must provide 60 days notice for contract terminations involving critical compounds. That would give Morrison Medical time to find alternative suppliers, if any existed. But here's the problem. For 7 of their most critical compounds, I held the only patents. There were no alternative suppliers. Not in the United States, not in Europe, not anywhere. If I stayed silent, I wouldn't just be accepting disrespect. I'd be enabling a man who saw my heritage as genetic pollution to profit from innovations I'd developed while he was still in elementary school. The social stakes were just as serious. There were 280 guests at this wedding. 45 of them were pharmaceutical industry executives. These were people who controlled regulatory approvals, who made partnership decisions, who influenced hiring throughout the industry. If I let Bradley's comments pass without consequence, what message would that send? That immigrants were acceptable targets? That success in America came with the right to humiliate those who built the infrastructure you depend on. But I also had to be careful. Unlike the movies, you can't just destroy someone's career with a phone call. The pharmaceutical industry is heavily regulated, closely monitored, and legally complex. Any action I took would have to be methodical, documented, and defensible. The final stake was personal reputation, not Tony Williams, sanitation worker, but the anonymous architect behind some of the pharmaceutical industry's most important innovations. For 25 years, I deliberately stayed invisible. Patent filings listed corporate entities, not personal names. Licensing agreements went through law firms and shell companies. Even my biggest innovations were attributed to the research teams that developed them further. I'd sacrificed recognition to build something bigger than ego. But now Bradley was forcing me to choose between continued invisibility and protecting my family's dignity. Some choices make themselves. Tonight, the invisible hand that shaped Morrison Medical's destiny was about to become visible. And Bradley Morrison was about to learn that in the pharmaceutical industry, your biggest supplier might be sitting right next to you wearing a Jose, bank suit, and work boots. The first confrontation happened during dinner service, and it started exactly as I expected it would. Bradley was getting anxious. The Morrison Medical executives at Table 3 were deep in conversation about their upcoming IPO, and he wasn't part of that discussion. So he did what insecure people always do. He tried to elevate himself by diminishing someone else. "Tony," Bradley called out across the room, loud enough for the pharmaceutical executives to hear. "Come over here for a minute." I walked over to the head table where Bradley was sitting with his groomsmen and several Morrison Medical mid-level managers. "Tony, we were just talking about the pharmaceutical industry. Fascinating stuff, right? All that complex regulatory framework and international compliance." His groomsmen chuckled. They knew what was coming. "Very complex," I agreed. "I was telling everyone how you've always been interested in business, even though you never really had the opportunity to participate at a professional level." The first cut. Precise and calculated. "Participation takes many forms," I said quietly. True. But let's be honest. There's a big difference between reading about an industry and actually working in it. Between understanding concepts theoretically and navigating real-world regulatory challenges. One of his groomsmen, a pharmaceutical sales rep named Kevin, jumped in. "The FDA approval process alone takes specialized expertise, supply chain compliance, patent law, international licensing agreements." "Chemistry is fascinating," I said. "Patent applications, regulatory filings, corporate structure optimization." Bradley's laugh was too loud, performed for the Morrison Medical managers who were now listening. "See what I mean? Tony reads everything he can get his hands on. Forbes, Wall Street Journal. He memorizes business terms." "Nothing wrong with curiosity," Dr. Hayes said from Table 3, having overheard the conversation. "Oh, absolutely not," Bradley continued. "I admire Tony's enthusiasm. It's just important to distinguish between academic interest and professional expertise." The second cut. Deeper this time. "For instance," Bradley continued, warming to his theme, "Tony probably thinks he understands how pharmaceutical supply chains work because he's read articles about them. But the reality involves international law, regulatory compliance, intellectual property licensing." "Morrison Medical has interesting supply relationships," I said casually. "Multiple jurisdictions, if I remember correctly." Kevin looked surprised. "How did you know that?" Bradley stepped in quickly. "Tony memorizes everything he reads. Tell them about your favorite magazines, Tony." "I prefer patent databases. More specific information about intellectual property ownership and licensing structures." Dr. Hayes was now fully focused on our conversation. "Which patent databases?" USPTO for domestic filings, EPO for European patents, WIPO for international applications, the ones that show actual ownership structures behind pharmaceutical innovations. Bradley's confidence flickered for just a moment. "Tony, you're making it sound like you actually work in patent law." "I didn't say I worked in patent law." "What did you say?" I looked around the group, 8 people now hanging on every word. "I said I understand ownership structures." Kevin leaned forward. "What kind of ownership structures?" "The kind where pharmaceutical companies license critical compounds without knowing who actually owns the patents." The table went quiet. Dr. Hayes stood up and walked over from Table 3. "Mr. Williams, that's remarkably specific knowledge for someone outside the industry." Bradley jumped in. "Tony reads a lot. Sometimes he gets confused about what he thinks he knows versus what he actually understands." The third cut. But this one felt different. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. Dr. Hayes, Morrison Medical licenses several compounds through Bellecourt Industries, correct? Dr. Hayes's eyebrows shot up. How could you possibly know that? Those are confidential licensing relationships. And those licenses are structured through Irish corporate entities for tax optimization? Dead silence. Bradley was staring at me like I'd started speaking in tongues. Tony, what are you doing? I'm discussing intellectual property licensing structures. Isn't that what we were talking about? Dr. Hayes sat down at our table. Mr. Williams, I need to ask you directly. How do you know about our licensing arrangements? Because I read patent filings very carefully. Patent filings don't show specific licensing terms. I looked at Bradley. His face was flushed red, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead. You're right, Dr. Hayes. Patent filings show ownership. Licensing terms are separate agreements. Then how? Patent filing 6,247,891. Water purification compound. Filed 1997, granted 1999. Licensed to Morrison Medical through Bellecourt Industries in 2019. Dr. Hayes was scrolling frantically through his phone now. That's one of our critical coding compounds. Patent filing 7,889,234. Electronic monitoring stabilizer. Filed 2003. Granted 2005. Licensed to Morrison Medical through Mediterranean Pharma Trust in 2020. Kevin was taking notes. How do you know these specific patent numbers? Bradley's voice cracked. Tony, you're embarrassing yourself. These people are actual pharmaceutical executives. Patent filing 8,445,167. Diagnostic Enhancement Matrix. Filed 2008, granted 2010. Licensed to Morrison Medical through Williams Chemical Solutions in 2021. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 20, 30. Dr. Hayes looked up from his phone. All 3 patents check out, filed by the entities you mentioned. Morrison Medical licenses approximately 47 pharmaceutical patents through various corporate structures. Total annual licensing fees, approximately $18 million. Bradley laughed, but it sounded forced now. Tony, you can't seriously be claiming that you know anything about multi-million-dollar licensing agreements. I stood up and straightened my jaws. A bank suit jacket. I'm not claiming I know anything about those licensing agreements, Bradley. Good, because I'm claiming I drafted them. The reaction was immediate, but controlled. Dr. Hayes didn't drop his phone this time. Instead, he set it down very carefully and looked at me with the focused attention of a man trying to solve a puzzle that could cost his company millions. That's... Dr. Hayes started, then stopped. That's a serious claim, Mr. Williams. It is, I agreed. Would you like me to provide documentation? What kind of documentation? I pulled out my wallet, the same worn leather wallet I'd carried for 15 years, and removed a business card. Not fancy cardstock this time. Just a simple white card with black text. A. Williams, patent consultant. Dr. Hayes took the card carefully. This could be anyone's card. It could be, I agreed. Would you like me to call the law firm that handles the licensing agreements? Which law firm? Hernandez, Martinez, and Associates. They've been handling my intellectual property matters since 1998. Bradley was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Tony, you can't possibly have a relationship with a major IP law firm. Small firm, actually, but very specialized in pharmaceutical patents. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Mr. Martinez, this is Tony Williams. I'm at my daughter's wedding, and I have some Morrison Medical executives here who'd like to verify some patent information. A familiar voice came through the speaker. Of course, Mr. Williams. Which patents do they need verified? Dr. Hayes leaned forward. Mr. Martinez, this is Dr. Richard Hayes from Morrison Medical. We'd like to verify the ownership of patent 6,247,891. Water purification compound, filed 1997. That's one of Mr. Williams' early patents, currently licensed to Morrison Medical through Bellecourt Industries. Annual licensing fee, $2.3 million. The pharmaceutical executives at our table exchanged glances. And patent 7,889,234? Dr. Hayes continued. Electronic monitoring stabilizer. Also Mr. Williams' patent, licensed through Mediterranean Pharma Trust. Annual fee, $4.7 million. Kevin was scribbling notes frantically. Mr. Martinez, how many patents does Mr. Williams hold? Current active patents, 47. Filed between 1997 and 2024. Total annual licensing revenue, approximately $38 million. Bradley's voice was barely a whisper. This can't be real. I looked at my watch. 8:15 p.m. The wedding speeches were scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. Mr. Martinez, thank you. We'll speak next week about the Morrison Medical Contract Review. Contract review? Dr. Hayes asked sharply. Routine compliance evaluation. All licensing agreements include periodic reviews for regulatory compliance and partnership standards. I hung up and looked around the table. 8 faces staring at me with varying degrees of shock, confusion, and concern. Dr. Hayes, I said quietly, I should probably mention something else. What now? The patent licensing agreements include ethical compliance clauses. What kind of clauses? Licensees must maintain professional standards consistent with pharmaceutical industry regulations and patient safety requirements. Dr. Hayes was suddenly very focused. Meaning what exactly? Meaning discriminatory behavior by licensee employees can trigger contract review procedures. Bradley stood up abruptly. Are you threatening Morrison Medical because of a conversation at a wedding? I'm not threatening anyone, Bradley. I'm explaining how pharmaceutical licensing agreements work. But if someone were to, hypothetically, demonstrate discriminatory behavior? I looked at Bradley, then back at Dr. Hayes. Hypothetically, that would trigger a mandatory review process, 60-day evaluation period, assessment of whether the behavior creates liability risks for the patent holder. And if the review determines there are liability risks, then the licensing agreement includes termination clauses, with appropriate notice periods, of course. The silence stretched between us. Dr. Hayes, I continued, I should also mention that pharmaceutical industry licensing networks share compliance information. Meaning what? Meaning if one company's employee creates liability issues, other patent holders in the network are notified, for their own risk assessment purposes. Bradley sat down heavily. You're talking about industry blacklisting. I'm talking about standard risk management practices in a heavily regulated industry. Dr. Hayes was making calculations in his head. Mr. Williams, exactly how many pharmaceutical companies license patents from your entities? Current licensees across all patent portfolios, approximately 137 companies. The number hung in the air like a time bomb. Including most major pharmaceutical manufacturers? Including most companies that matter in the pharmaceutical industry. Bradley's face had gone completely white. But that's all theoretical, of course, I said, standing up. Just business discussions between colleagues. I straightened my suit jacket and smiled. Now, I believe the wedding speeches are about to begin. At 8:30 p.m. sharp, Bradley stood up to give his wedding speech. The revelation about my patent portfolio had shaken him, but not humbled him. If anything, it seemed to make him more determined to assert his superiority. Some people learn from shock. Others double down on their prejudices. Bradley was definitely a doubler down. 280 guests turned their attention to the head table. The pharmaceutical executives from Morrison Medical sat at table 3, wine glasses raised, still processing what they'd learned during dinner about my patent licensing empire. Ladies and gentlemen, Bradley began, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced confidence, tonight is about more than just a wedding. It's about the joining of 2 families, 2 backgrounds, 2 very different approaches to success. I sat at the family table watching him carefully. My phone was discreetly recording everything, a habit I'd developed during 25 years of patent negotiations. Maria and I represent something beautiful about America, the opportunity for advancement through education, strategic thinking, and understanding how complex systems really work. A few polite chuckles from the crowd. Bradley was warming up, finding his rhythm. Now I know some of you have met Maria's father, Tony. He's lived quite an interesting life. 35 years in America, working his way up from absolute poverty, and I mean that literally. Absolute poverty. The first warning sign. His tone was shifting from celebration to something else. Tony works in sanitation. He drives a garbage truck through the streets of Miami every morning at 4:30 a.m., rain or shine, for 30 years. That's dedication. That's the kind of work ethic we all claim to admire. Polite applause. But I could feel the energy in the room changing. But tonight isn't just about honoring manual labor. It's about celebrating intellectual advancement, Maria's advancement. Our children's genetic advancement. He paused for effect, looking directly at me. See, what makes America great isn't just that anyone can work hard. It's that the smartest, most capable people can rise above their circumstances. And tonight, Maria is rising significantly above her circumstances. Dr. Hayes was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The other pharmaceutical executives were beginning to sense what was coming. Maria is joining a family that understands complex industries at the highest levels. A family that operates in boardrooms, not garbage trucks. A family that speaks the language of pharmaceutical innovation and regulatory science. The condescension was becoming unmistakable now. Now, I want to be clear. There's absolutely nothing wrong with Tony's background. Manual labor serves an important function in society. But let's be realistic about the intellectual differences between our families. Uncomfortable whispers started at the back tables. Tony represents old-world thinking. Work harder, not smarter. Keep your head down. Be grateful for whatever opportunities come your way. Accept your place in the social hierarchy. Bradley's voice was getting louder, more confident. The alcohol and adrenaline were taking over. But Maria and I represent New World intelligence, innovation over imitation, leadership over labor, building intellectual empires instead of just cleaning up after them. Several audible gasps from the crowd. This was going beyond poor taste. I know Tony might feel intellectually overwhelmed tonight, being around pharmaceutical executives, regulatory scientists, people who make decisions affecting millions of patients, and that's understandable. Dr. Hayes was typing rapidly on his phone. Other pharmaceutical executives were exchanging concerned glances, because the truth is, success in modern America isn't just about physical work anymore. Anyone can lift garbage cans. Success requires understanding complex regulatory frameworks, international patent law, sophisticated corporate structures. The room was getting quieter, more tense. Things that frankly require a certain level of genetic intellectual capacity, educational background, cultural sophistication. Maria started to stand up. I gently placed my hand on her arm and shook my head. Now, I don't want anyone to think I'm not grateful for Tony's contribution to our family gene pool, but I think it's important to be honest about what our children will inherit. The pharmaceutical executives at Table 3 were staring at their plates. This was becoming professionally embarrassing. See, when you're building a family, when you're thinking about children and grandchildren, you have to consider genetic realities. What intellectual advantages or cultural disadvantages get passed down? The crowd was completely silent now. 280 people watching a man destroy himself in real time. Maria is getting a genetic upgrade tonight. From a world of manual labor and broken English to pharmaceutical innovation and international business sophistication. The silence was absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. And our children will inherit my family's intellectual capacity, educational advantages, and cultural refinement. And from Tony's side, well, they'll learn the value of persistence. He paused, looking directly at me with what he probably thought was generous acknowledgement. Because that's what America is about. Taking the useful genetic traits from different backgrounds and gradually improving the bloodline over generations. Maria was crying now, not tears of joy, tears of humiliation and rage. So when I look at Tony tonight, I don't see genetic contamination. That would be too harsh. I see genetic raw material that my family can refine and improve over time. The words hung in the air like toxic gas. I see a future where our children speak perfect, unaccented English, where they understand complex intellectual concepts, where they don't have to worry about cultural barriers or being perceived as foreign. Dr. Hayes buried his face in his hands. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks the beginning of a genetic improvement project, taking the work ethic of Italian immigration and combining it with the intellectual superiority of American pharmaceutical leadership. The crowd was horrified. Several people were already gathering their purses and coats. So let's raise our glasses to Maria, who had the intelligence to marry up genetically, to bloodlines that improve over generations through strategic breeding, and to a future where our children won't have to empty garbage cans to survive. He raised his champagne glass toward me in a mock toast. To Tony Williams, whose greatest genetic contribution is raising a daughter smart enough to escape his intellectual limitations. The silence was absolute. 280 people holding their breath, waiting to see what happened next. I stood up slowly. Every eye in the room turned to me. "Thank you, Bradley," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. That was very educational. Bradley's smile faltered slightly. Tony, you don't need to respond. Actually, I do need to respond. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my phone. Because you mentioned something interesting about intellectual capacity and genetic improvement. I touched the screen and activated the recording function, then put the phone on speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, since Bradley seems so interested in intellectual capacity and genetic superiority, I'd like to share some information about pharmaceutical innovation. Bradley's face went white. What are you doing? I'm giving everyone an education about where pharmaceutical innovations actually come from. I looked around the room at 280 stunned faces, and about what happens when someone with actual intellectual capacity decides to stop being invisible. I didn't use dramatic phone calls this time. Real pharmaceutical business doesn't work like that. Instead, I pulled out my worn leather wallet and removed a single document I'd been carrying for 27 years. My first patent certificate, now yellowed with age. "Bradley," I said, my voice calm and measured, "you mentioned genetic intellectual capacity. Let me show you what that actually looks like." I held up the patent certificate. United States patent, 6,247,891. Water purification compound. Filed September 15, 1997. Inventor, Antonio Williams. The crowd leaned forward, trying to read the document. This patent is currently licensed to Morrison Medical Systems for their surgical instrument sterilization process. Annual licensing fee, $2.3 million. Dr. Hayes stood up slowly. "Mr. Williams, may I see that certificate?" I walked over to table 3 and placed the document in front of him. "This is just the first patent. There are 46 others." While Dr. Hayes examined the certificate, I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. Patent 7,889,234. Electronic monitoring stabilizer. Licensed to Morrison Medical through Mediterranean Pharma Trust. Annual fee, $4.7 million. I walked back toward the center of the ballroom so everyone could hear clearly. Patent 8,445,167. Diagnostic Enhancement Matrix. Licensed to Morrison Medical through Williams Chemical Solutions. Annual fee, $3.1 million. The pharmaceutical executives at Table 3 were frantically searching their phones, cross-referencing patent numbers with their company's licensing agreements. In total, Morrison Medical Systems licenses 47 pharmaceutical compounds from corporate entities I control. Total annual licensing fees, approximately $18 million. Dr. Hayes looked up from the patent certificate. This is legitimate. USPTO seal, proper filing dates, everything. But here's what's interesting, I continued. Morrison Medical has no idea they're licensing these patents from me. Your contracts are with Bellecourt Industries, Mediterranean Pharma Trust, Williams Chemical Solutions, and 4 other corporate entities. Dr. Janet Morrison was typing rapidly on her laptop. Our compliance department shows contracts with all those entities, all registered in different jurisdictions. Delaware LLCs, Cayman Islands trusts, Irish corporations, completely legal corporate structures used throughout the pharmaceutical industry. I looked at Bradley, who was sitting motionless at the head table. "Bradley, you mentioned intellectual superiority and genetic capacity. Let me explain how someone with actual intellectual capacity builds a pharmaceutical empire." I walked back toward the head table, speaking to the entire room. In 1997, while working sanitation routes through Miami's industrial district, I noticed patterns in the chemical waste streams, certain combinations of compounds that weren't being utilized effectively. The crowd was listening intently now. So I started experimenting, borrowed time in the University of Miami chemistry lab, filed my first patent application using $500 I'd saved from overtime pay. I stopped directly in front of Bradley. That first patent, the one Dr. Hayes is holding, now generates over $2 million annually in licensing revenue. Bradley's voice was barely a whisper. This can't be real. Over the next 27 years, I filed 46 additional patents, all while working full-time in sanitation, all while building a corporate structure that would protect my innovations and optimize tax efficiency. I pulled out another document. This is the incorporation certificate for Williams Chemical Solutions LLC, filed in Delaware in 2003. I am the sole managing member. Dr. Hayes was examining the document. This shows ownership of multiple pharmaceutical patents. Pharmaceutical patents that Morrison Medical depends on for 68% of their critical manufacturing processes. The silence in the room was absolute. "Dr. Hayes," I continued, "would you like to see the licensing agreement between Williams Chemical Solutions and Morrison Medical?"
We have confidential agreements. Here's your copy.
I handed him a thick document. Signed by you personally in March 2023. 5-year exclusive licensing agreement for compounds XR 247 through XR 253. Dr. Hayes flipped through the pages, recognizing his own signature on multiple pages. Now here's where it gets interesting, I said. These licensing agreements include specific ethical compliance clauses. What kind of clauses? I opened to page 47 of the contract. Section 12.3, Ethical Standards. Licensee agrees to maintain professional standards consistent with pharmaceutical industry regulations and patient safety requirements. Dr. Hayes read the clause aloud. Discriminatory behavior by licensee employees may constitute grounds for contract review and potential termination. And Section 12.4, I continued, Industry Standards. Licensor reserves the right to terminate agreements if licensee personnel engage in behavior that creates liability risks or damages industry reputation. Bradley finally found his voice. You can't terminate pharmaceutical contracts because of personal opinions. You're absolutely right, Bradley. I can't terminate contracts because of personal opinions. Relief flickered across his face. But I can initiate contract reviews for ethical violations, and those reviews take 60 days to complete, per FDA Drug Supply Chain Security Act regulations. I looked around the room. During those 60 days, all affected pharmaceutical compounds would be subject to supply disruption protocols. Dr. Hayes was calculating rapidly. 60 days without access to 47 critical compounds would likely result in Morrison Medical's inability to fulfill existing manufacturing contracts, which would trigger penalty clauses with your clients, which would impact your upcoming IPO valuation. The mathematical reality was settling in across the table. But that's just one company, I continued.
The interesting part is that pharmaceutical patent licensing networks share compliance information. I pulled out my tablet and showed them a document. Current licensees of patents controlled by Williams Chemical Solutions and related entities, 137 pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Janet Morrison leaned forward. You're saying that ethical violations could affect licensing relationships across the entire industry? I'm saying that pharmaceutical companies conduct risk assessments when evaluating personnel who might create liability exposure. I looked directly at Bradley. And discriminatory behavior represents significant liability exposure in a heavily regulated industry. This is insane, Bradley said. You're threatening to destroy careers because of a wedding speech. I'm not threatening anything, Bradley. I'm explaining how the pharmaceutical industry actually works. I walked back to the center of the ballroom. For 27 years, I've built innovations that keep pharmaceutical companies profitable. For 27 years, I've licensed those innovations through anonymous corporate structures. For 27 years, Retry P continue. I've deliberately stayed invisible so that my work could speak for itself. I stopped and looked around the room at 280 faces. But tonight, you forced me to choose between continued invisibility and protecting my family's dignity. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 20. 30. Dr. Hayes, I said quietly, Morrison Medical can avoid any compliance issues very simply. How? By demonstrating that discriminatory behavior has consequences, by showing that your company prioritizes ethical leadership over personal relationships. Dr. Hayes looked at Bradley, then back at me. You're asking us to fire Bradley. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm explaining the risk assessment that pharmaceutical patent holders conduct when evaluating business relationships. I pulled out one final document. This is a letter from Hernandez, Martinez, and Associates, my intellectual property law firm. It outlines the standard procedures for contract compliance reviews in cases involving ethical violations. Dr. Hayes took the letter and read it carefully. This says that formal complaints trigger mandatory 60-day review periods, during which supply relationships are suspended pending resolution. And if the review determines that ethical violations occurred, then the licensing agreements include termination clauses, standard industry practice. Bradley stood up shakily. You're destroying my career because you can't take a joke. I looked at him for a long moment. Bradley, your speech wasn't a joke. It was a revelation of character. And in the pharmaceutical industry, character matters. I turned back to Dr. Hayes. The review process begins with a formal complaint filing, which I can submit to my law firm Monday morning. Or Morrison Medical can demonstrate that ethical violations have immediate consequences, that discriminatory behavior is incompatible with pharmaceutical industry standards. The choice hung in the air between us. Dr. Hayes looked around the table at his colleagues, then pulled out his phone. I need to call an emergency board meeting. Dr. Hayes, I said softly, there's one more thing you should know. What now? If Morrison Medical chooses to address this situation proactively, Williams Chemical Solutions would be interested in expanding our licensing relationship. His eyebrows raised. Expanding how? I have 17 additional patents in development, compounds that could revolutionize medical device manufacturing, currently unlicensed. I paused. But only available to companies that demonstrate commitment to ethical leadership. Dr. Hayes was doing rapid calculations. What would expanded licensing look like? Exclusive 5-year agreements, total value approximately $50 million annually, $25 million increase over current licensing fees. The number hung in the air like a golden carrot. But available only to companies that prove they prioritize patient safety through ethical employment practices. Bradley was staring at me like I was a stranger. You're bribing them to fire me. I'm offering expanded business relationships to companies that meet pharmaceutical industry ethical standards. I looked around the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight is how the pharmaceutical industry actually operates. Innovations come from unexpected places. Business relationships depend on trust and character, and ethical violations have real consequences. I walked back toward my family table. The choice is simple, Dr. Hayes. Morrison Medical can keep an employee who publicly demonstrated discriminatory behavior, or they can partner with the patent holder who controls 68% of their critical manufacturing processes. I sat down next to Maria, who was still processing everything she'd learned about her father. But that choice has to be made in the next few minutes. Because I have a conference call with my legal team at 10 p.m. tonight. Dr. Hayes looked at his watch. 9:45 p.m. 15 minutes to decide whether Morrison Medical prioritizes personal loyalty or business survival. The silence in the ballroom was complete. Bradley was sitting alone at the head table, finally understanding that he'd just forced a choice between his career and his company's future, and everyone in the room knew which choice would be made. The decision came faster than I expected. Dr. Hayes didn't need 15 minutes. He needed 15 seconds to run the math. Lose one employee who'd become a liability, or lose $18 million in annual licensing fees plus $50 million in potential new business. Bradley, Dr. Hayes said quietly, walking over to the head table. We need to talk. Not here, Bradley replied, gesturing toward the crowd. Not in front of everyone. Actually, yes, here. Because everyone needs to understand that Morrison Medical takes ethical violations seriously. Dr. Hayes' voice carried clearly across the silent ballroom. Bradley Morrison, your employment with Morrison Medical Systems is terminated, effective immediately, for violation of our code of conduct and ethical standards. You can't fire me at my own wedding. I just did. Your access credentials will be deactivated tonight. You'll receive formal termination documentation Monday morning. But I wasn't finished. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't work on dramatic firings. It works on documented procedures and legal processes. Dr. Hayes, I said, standing up again, there's still the matter of the formal compliance review. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and dialed my law firm. Mr. Martinez, this is Tony Williams. We need to initiate a standard compliance review for Morrison Medical Systems. My lawyer's voice came through the speaker. What type of review, Mr. Williams? Ethical Standards Review under Section 12.3 of our licensing agreements. Discriminatory behavior by licensee personnel. Standard 60-day review period. Standard procedure. Morrison Medical will receive formal notification Monday morning, along with documentation of the violations. Dr. Hayes looked concerned. What happens during the review period? Mr. Martinez answered, Williams Chemical Solutions and related entities will suspend new licensing agreements pending review completion. Existing agreements remain in effect, but renewal negotiations are frozen. I looked at Dr. Hayes. This means Morrison Medical's upcoming IPO will include a disclosure about pending licensing reviews, which might affect your valuation. By how much? IPO lawyers typically apply 20 to 30% valuation discounts for material contract uncertainties. Dr. Hayes was calculating rapidly. $2 billion IPO valuation minus 25% discount equals $500 million in lost market capitalization. Mr. Martinez, Dr. Hayes called out, what would resolve the compliance review? Demonstration that the licensee has addressed the ethical violations and implemented preventive measures typically includes personnel changes,
policy updates, and compliance training. We've terminated the violating employee. That's a good start. The review would also evaluate whether the violations represent isolated incidents or systemic issues.
I walked over to table 3. Dr. Hayes, I should mention that Bradley's discriminatory statements weren't limited to tonight. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and opened a voice recording app. March 15th, 2024. Conference call between Bradley Morrison and European suppliers. I played a 30-second recording. Bradley's voice came through clearly. Look, we prefer working with European suppliers because frankly they understand quality control better than American companies that have to meet diversity quotas. When you're dealing with pharmaceutical compounds, you can't afford to have people who got their jobs through affirmative action instead of merit. Dr. Hayes went pale. When was this recorded? Standard business practice. All pharmaceutical supplier calls are recorded for quality assurance and regulatory compliance. I played another recording. Between you and me, I'm glad we found suppliers who share our values about cultural homogeneity. When you're dealing with patient safety, you want people who think like you do. Dr. Janet Morrison buried her face in her hands. This is documented discrimination. This could destroy our IPO. Mr. Martinez, I continued, please explain the industry notification protocol. Standard procedure requires notifying other pharmaceutical companies about ethical violations that might affect industry-wide risk assessments. How many companies would be notified? All major pharmaceutical manufacturers, approximately 130 companies. They need the information for their own compliance evaluations. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Every pharmaceutical executive in the room understood what had just happened. Bradley hadn't just lost his job. He'd created an industry-wide incident that would follow him everywhere. However, Mr. Martinez continued, if the licensee demonstrates proactive remediation, the review can be expedited.
What constitutes proactive remediation? Dr. Hayes asked. Personnel termination, policy implementation, industry notification of corrective actions, and commitment to ongoing compliance monitoring. I looked at Dr. Hayes. Morrison Medical could turn this into a positive story. Company that discovered ethical violations and took immediate action. Company that prioritizes patient safety over personal relationships. How? Press release Monday morning. Morrison Medical strengthens ethical standards. Announcement of enhanced diversity and inclusion policies. Commitment to industry-leading compliance. Dr. Hayes was thinking quickly. That could actually help our IPO. Show investors that we have strong governance and risk management. And, I continued, Williams Chemical Solutions would be prepared to announce expanded licensing relationships with companies that demonstrate ethical leadership.
The $50 million partnership you mentioned. Exclusive licensing for 17 next-generation compounds. 5-year agreement. $25 million annual increase over current licensing fees. Dr. Janet Morrison was typing rapidly on her laptop. That would more than offset any IPO valuation discount. Actually increase our projected value. I walked back to the center of the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight is how the pharmaceutical industry self-regulates. Ethical violations have immediate consequences, but companies that demonstrate integrity get rewarded. I looked around the room. Morrison Medical will receive formal documentation of tonight's resolution Monday morning. The compliance review will be completed within 2 weeks, assuming continued cooperation. And Bradley? Someone called out from table 8. Bradley Morrison will receive documentation that he violated pharmaceutical industry ethical standards. That documentation will be available to any potential employers who request background verification. I walked over to where Bradley was sitting alone at the head table. Bradley, you asked earlier about genetic intellectual capacity. Let me explain something about intelligence. He looked up with hollow eyes. Intelligence isn't inherited. It's applied. You had every advantage. Education, connections, opportunities. But you chose to use those advantages to diminish others instead of building something meaningful. I paused. That's not genetic failure. That's character failure. The crowd was listening to every word. Real intellectual capacity builds bridges, creates opportunities, solves problems that benefit everyone. I looked around the room. What you've seen tonight is the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. The real consequences began unfolding over the following weeks, not minutes. Unlike the movies, careers don't get destroyed instantly. They unravel slowly through industry networks, background checks, and professional references that gradually close doors.
Within 72 hours, Morrison Medical's board of directors had implemented exactly what my lawyer recommended. Press release announcing enhanced ethical standards, company-wide diversity training, public commitment to industry-leading compliance practices. The pharmaceutical trade journals picked up the story immediately, not the wedding drama, but the business angle. Morrison Medical strengthens governance ahead of IPO. Pharmaceutical company demonstrates proactive risk management. Their stock valuation actually increased. Investors love companies that identify and resolve problems before they become scandals. Dr. Hayes called me the following Tuesday. Mr. Williams, the board would like to discuss the expanded licensing arrangement. Of course, but I should mention that Williams Chemical Solutions has a 6-month evaluation period for new partnerships. What kind of evaluation? We monitor diversity hiring, ethical training implementation, compliance culture, make sure our partnership aligns with our values. And if Morrison Medical meets those standards, then we discuss exclusive licensing for the next generation compounds, potentially worth $75 million annually, not $50. The carrot had gotten bigger. Good behavior gets rewarded in the pharmaceutical industry, but Bradley's consequences were accumulating differently. The first sign came 10 days after the wedding. A headhunter called about a position at Pfizer. Bradley, I need to ask about something that came up in your background check. There's a note in the pharmaceutical industry database about ethical compliance issues. What kind of note? Says you violated industry standards for discriminatory behavior.
Is that accurate? Bradley tried to explain, tried to minimize, tried to reframe. But pharmaceutical companies don't take risks with personnel who have documented ethical violations. The second sign came 3 weeks later. A former colleague from Yale called. Brad, I heard something weird. My company's HR department flagged your resume for industry compliance issues. What's that about? Word was spreading through professional networks. Not gossip, but documented information that pharmaceutical companies shared for risk management purposes. The third sign was the most devastating. A job offer from a medical device startup got rescinded after the background check. Mr. Morrison, we've discovered that you're listed in the pharmaceutical industry ethics database. Our insurance company won't cover employees with documented compliance violations. That's when Bradley realized the full scope of what had happened. It wasn't just about one job, or one company, or one industry conversation. The pharmaceutical industry had collectively decided he was too risky to employ. Meanwhile, Maria was making her own decisions. She filed for divorce 6 weeks after the wedding, not because of the public humiliation, but because of what she'd learned about the man she'd married. Dad, she told me during one of our weekly dinners, it wasn't the speech that convinced me. It was watching him try to blame everyone else afterward. No accountability, no remorse, just anger that his actions had consequences. And the pregnancy? I'm keeping the baby, but raising them with values you taught me, not the ones Bradley demonstrated. She paused. And I want them to know their grandfather's real story. Not the sanitation worker story, but the immigrant innovator story. That's when I made a decision I'd been avoiding for 27 years. Mija, would you like to work at Williams Chemical Solutions? Doing what? You have a chemical engineering degree. We need someone to head our next generation compound development program. Dad, I can't just get hired because I'm your daughter. You won't be. Dr. Chen will interview you. The board will evaluate your qualifications. You'll start as a junior researcher and earn your promotions. And if I'm not good enough, then you'll find another job like everyone else. But I suspect you inherited the right kind of intelligence. She started work 8 weeks later. Entry-level position, same salary as any new engineering graduate, but with access to some of the most innovative pharmaceutical research in the industry. 6 months after the wedding, Morrison Medical completed their IPO at a valuation 15% higher than originally projected. Investors were impressed by their proactive ethical standards and expanded licensing partnerships. Bradley Morrison was working as a quality control inspector at a generic drug manufacturer in Ohio. Annual salary, $47,000. No stock options, no advancement prospects, no involvement in pharmaceutical innovation. His Yale MBA was effectively worthless in the pharmaceutical industry. Too risky to hire, too expensive to retrain for other industries. But the most important consequence was cultural. The pharmaceutical industry started implementing what they called Williams Standards, enhanced ethical screening for all personnel involved in patient safety. Named after the anonymous patent holder who demonstrated how discriminatory behavior creates liability risks. They had no idea the standards were named after a sanitation worker from Little Havana,
which was exactly how I preferred it. Real change happens quietly, through systems and standards, not speeches and dramatic gestures. The industry became more ethical, patients became safer, and discriminatory behavior became professionally suicidal. All because someone finally called out genetic superiority theories for what they really were, character deficiencies disguised as intellectual advantages. 2 years later, I still drive Route 23B through Little Havana every morning at 4:30 a.m. Not because I have to, because I choose to. The work reminds me where innovations come from, watching systems, identifying problems, finding solutions that others miss. My best patent ideas still come during those quiet hours before the city wakes up. Maria visits every Sunday for dinner at my apartment. Same one-bedroom place I've lived in for 15 years. Same furniture, same kitchen table where I developed my first pharmaceutical processes. She's 5 months pregnant now. The divorce was finalized last month. Bradley didn't contest anything. Hard to argue for alimony when you're unemployable. "Dad," she said last Sunday, "I've been thinking about the baby's name. What did you decide? If it's a boy, I want to name him Antonio, after his grandfather. And if it's a girl, Antonia, so she'll know that intelligence comes from character, not genetics." We were sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd drafted my first patent application 27 years ago. Now Maria was working on her own patent applications, 3 innovative compounds that could revolutionize cancer treatment. "Mia, I want to tell you something about that night. The wedding? I wasn't trying to destroy Bradley's career. I was trying to protect your future, your children's future." "I know, Dad, but I also want you to understand something else. Power isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility." She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I could have destroyed Morrison Medical completely. Could have terminated all their contracts, caused thousands of job losses, ruined innocent people's lives. Why didn't you?" "Because good people worked there. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Morrison, hundreds of employees who had nothing to do with Bradley's behavior. They deserve better than collective punishment for one person's failures." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Little Havana's morning routines. "That's the difference between power and privilege, Mia. Privilege uses authority to hurt people. Power uses authority to protect people. Even people who don't know they're being protected, especially those people." My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. "Williams Chemical Solutions board meeting tomorrow, discussing the scholarship program launch. $5 million annually. Pharmaceutical education for immigrant students, starting next month." I showed Maria the text. "Your grandfather's name will be on those scholarships." "Antonio Williams Memorial Scholarship? No, just A. Williams Innovation Fund, anonymous like everything else." She smiled. "Some traditions are worth keeping." Outside, my sanitation truck was parked in its usual spot. Tomorrow morning at 4:30, I'd be back on Route 23B, thinking about the next innovation that could help patients while the world assumed I was just collecting garbage. Some people build monuments to themselves. Others build systems that outlive them. I chose systems. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Hit subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Fellow immigrants especially, your stories matter more than you realize. Remember, true power doesn't announce itself. It just makes the world a little better,